So let me begin with a disclaimer. If you are an established researcher or doing any kind of bioacoustic research, maybe your time's better spent walking in the warm sun outside. This is going to be really, I was asked to keep it really, really basic, so I've made it really, really basic. So this is probably going to be old hat, boring to a lot of you. So I'm not going to feel bad if a whole lot of you walk out of the room at any point. If you're an early career bioacoustics researcher, a student starting out, maybe this will be of use to you. It'll be about an hour long. But as I said, it just can be. I know how boring it can be because I've given the talk so many times. Okay, so please feel free to leave whenever you feel like, and least of all, do not stay out of politeness. Yeah. So with that, and I was asked to make it really basic, accessible to just about anybody, with some focus on insects. I was asked to cover making and analyzing recordings, biodiversity monitoring, behavioral experts, a lot to do. I usually do this in 3 lectures, and I made this very strange. In India, we call it khichdi. It's a mix of stuff to try and cover all of this. So I've tried to go through as much as possible, but I'm, as I said, going to start really, really basic. So, right, basic enough as to ask what's sound. And so just to remind ourselves of probably middle school physics, yeah? So sound, as we know it, produced by a vibrating body, right? And just to illustrate that from a nice cartoon in Jeff Kamai's book, typically you have some kind of a vibrating membrane, and as that membrane pushes outward, the molecules of the medium in the local area get compressed, so you get a small pressure compression, and then the membrane moves back to starting position and then moves outward. So it's a simple harmonic motion, so it pushes out, goes back, goes out in the other direction and comes back. This is one full cycle. So you get a local compression here, comes back, goes out the other side, so you get a local rarefaction and the pressure goes down, and then you come back to the middle. So if you graph that, then, oh, this is the wrong thing. It's showing here distance. Actually, this should be time. Okay. But basically, what you will find if you plot this, I think it's on the next slide. Yeah. If you plot this, what you'll find is that in one cycle, the pressure goes up to a max, comes back to whatever was ambient pressure, then the next half of the cycle goes down and comes back again. So you get a sine wave, which is therefore characterized by a period, right? Which is the time taken for one full oscillation, right? So you could go from here to here, or you could go from this peak to this peak. That's the period. And the number of times the body oscillates per second specifies the frequency, which is measured in hertz. I think that's what's now up over there. Yeah. So there are a few things we need to define. The first is the amplitude, which is really the maximum change from the ambient pressure during one cycle of a sine wave. And the frequency, which I said is the number of cycles or oscillations per second. And the reason that I emphasize this is year after year when I teach students, they keep confusing amplitude and frequency. So amplitude is the max pressure change during one cycle, whereas frequency is the number of cycles per second. And they have a very simple inverse relation. F is 1 by t. You can look at the same thing in space rather than time. And because this compression, sort of local compression, travels outward, once you get the local compression here, that then causes a compression in the next piece of medium, whether it's air or water, and so on. And this travels outward. So you can instead take a snapshot in space, when you'll again get this kind of sinusoidal waveform of alternating compressions and rarefactions. And here, what you can then look at is the distance that this between two of these peaks, which is called the wavelength, right? Which is how far out this max compression moves in one period. So the wavelength is a distance. Is there anything else over here? Okay. And there's a speed of propagation of this wave, which depends on both the temperature and the elasticity of the medium, which is about 343 meters per second for sound and air at 20 degrees. Something else to keep in mind, the speed changes with the medium, it changes with the temperature, it changes with the elasticity of the medium, something we tend to forget. Right, is that all the basics? Yeah. So from all of this, of course, comes this very simple equation again, because lambda is a wavelength, it's a distance, it's the speed of sound measured by the time for one cycle. So lambda is CT. So these are very, very basic, but they're things that we'll do well to keep in our heads all the time whenever you hear any kind of animal sound. When you're looking at long wavelengths or when you're looking at short wavelengths, relation between frequency and period, they have to keep buzzing in your heads. So measuring sound, what are the sorts of terminology that people often use to measure sound? Because I remember as a starting student, I did not have the opportunity. I'm completely self-learned in almost everything I've done, and certainly in acoustics. And it used to be bewildering looking at all these catalogs and trying to make sense of all the terminology, which is how I learned all of it. And basically, when you measure amplitude, you'll see things like peak, peak to peak, and RMS, and what do they mean? So peak basically is going from the ambient to the max displacement. The peak to peak is actually the amplitude from the max to the min. Yeah. Another terminology you'll see very often is the RMS, or the root mean squared sound pressure level. And that's exactly what the terminology means, which is basically you square the instantaneous amplitude at every point, okay? And you take the mean of all of those squares over a particular time window and then take the square root of that. And why do you do that? That allows you to sort of rectify the signal first. So you make everything positive if you square the instantaneous amplitude at every point. And it also allows you to do something that can be quite important depending on the kind of signal that you're studying. For example, if you have a cricket signal that doesn't change very much over time, it's often more useful to have an RMS measurement, a sort of an average over a particular time window, rather than just taking a peak, because a peak could just be some instantaneous up, which may not be very meaningful. So the RMS can often be quite useful if you have long continuous signals which don't vary too much in amplitude over time. On the other hand, if you're looking, say, at a bat signal, or you're looking at something that really changes very quickly in amplitude, then maybe you're better off actually looking at the peak, otherwise you lose a lot of information, right? And the unit of sound pressure, the sound pressure level, is newtons per square meter, or Pascal, keeping in mind that this sound is basically force per unit area. The other confusion that often happens is between sound pressure level and sound intensity, right? And we often sort of loosely use these terms as biologists, but they're actually quite different from each other. What you measure when you use a sound level meter is basically the sound pressure level, because your sound level meter measures using a microphone, which is sensitive to the pressure, just like your eardrum, right? So that's actually what you measure. Sound intensity is a somewhat different beast, and not everybody needs it. except in some special cases where you're modeling stuff. But that's actually the sound energy per unit area per unit time. So it's actually a measure of power per unit area, right? So this comes much closer to the actual sound energy. And its units actually is watts per square centimeter. And the intensity, and this is an important relationship, is directly proportional to the square of the instantaneous pressure. So that's the somewhat complicated relationship between sound intensity and sound pressure level. And so we should be careful at the very least not to use these two terms interchangeably. Remember that most of the time what you actually measure is sound pressure level, and it's better to stick to that terminology. The units, yes, are the very confusing piece in sound, because sound pressure is measured in decibels. It's a logarithmic unit and defined so, 20 times logarithm base 10 p by p ref. And as you can see from this formula, the decibel level is always relative to a reference pressure level, something most of us neglect to mention in much of our writing. But a decibel has very little meaning without referring to the reference pressure level. And if you just, so what does this mean? If p ref can be anything you choose, you can define what your p ref is. When you use a sound level meter, that is calibrated to a standard reference level. And that is defined as the sound pressure. It's a really weird definition, but that's the definition. So sound pressure of a 1 kilohertz tone at the threshold of human hearing. So basically, this is a psychophysically defined reference level. That is, if you play out a 1 kilohertz tone and listen to when or figure out when the average human just about hears it, that is 0 dB SPL, which is equal to 20 micropascals, thinking about it in terms of the physical units. So this is the standard reference level that your sound level meter uses. So when you say I have my ambient noise in my city is 60 dB SPL, what we really mean, because I measured it with an SPL meter, what we really mean is that it's 60 dB SPL with reference to 20 micropascal, okay? But you don't need to be limited to that at all. You can set whatever you want as your reference, because the decibel really is a relative scale. In fact, when I was doing my postdoc on grasshoppers, I used to do it a lot of the time, that I would set a particular reference level and then say, 10 decibel higher than this, or 20 decibel higher than this. And as long as you specify that reference, it doesn't matter, but you must specify the reference. So whenever you use the term decibel, always specify the reference sound pressure level. And this is just a little rule of thumb, which comes from this formula. So if you double the sound pressure level, the decibel level will go up by 6. And if you triple the amplitude, it'll be very close to about 9.5. So basically, when you see something has gone up by 6 dB, it's double the amplitude. And when something has gone up by 10 dB, it's about 3 times the amplitude. As I said, only standard sound level meters are calibrated to directly measure sound pressure levels relative to 20 micropascal. And all other decibel measurements are relative to some other reference, which needs to be specified. And I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes, because nowadays when you use software, almost anything, and any spectrum you produce will come to that, will give you dB levels, and they're not very meaningful. And people sometimes interpret those, but really you shouldn't be interpreting them at all, except on a relative scale. Okay. This is just, as I said, very, very basic stuff. So that's our sine wave, and that's just to illustrate for students the difference between frequency and amplitude. So here's 100 cycles per second, and here is 200, which is double the number of cycles per second. And here is half the amplitude. And the interesting thing, of course, is that animals perceptually sense these differences, and we sense amplitude differences as differences in loudness, and we sense frequency differences. So I didn't embed these, so I have to ask him to play it. Yeah. So this is just, yeah, that's 100 hertz. Sorry. You can go to the next one. The next one? Yeah, that's 200. So that's just to make the point, we can actually hear these differences. These are just sine waves I generated on the computer. Let me go back. So this representation where you can actually see these oscillations or changes in amplitude with time is what we call the oscillogram or the time series. But of course, basically, in this sine wave, there's only one frequency. This can all be collapsed into one term that's 100 hertz. And so you can also represent it differently. You can also represent it as the frequency spectrum or the power spectrum. And that's basically based on this magical theorem that I'm sure many people in the audience know much more about, the Fourier transform. And it basically states, but all we need to worry about is that any continuous waveform can be broken down. A complex waveform, which may have multiple sine waves in it, can be broken down into a set of pure sinusoidal waves whose frequencies, amplitudes, and relative phases will completely describe the signal. So basically, sound has the nice characteristic that even a complex waveform containing multiple frequencies can, using this magical technique, be broken down into its constituent frequency components, and you can even know their relative amplitudes and phases. You can even use that to reconstruct the signal. So that's the frequency spectrum. So let's look a little more at this. Here you've got frequency on this axis, and here we go again. We have amplitude on this axis. When you have only a sine wave, of course, you should just get one line, basically, on the power spectrum, because there's only one frequency in this signal. As I told you, you will see an amplitude here, which is actually better described as relative amplitude. And this is really useful to see how the energy is spread across the different frequencies. And in this case, of course, for a pure sine wave, all of it should be in one frequency. And here we look at a few more examples. So with 500 hertz, you get one peak. At 500 here, with 5,000 hertz, you'll get one peak. And you can hear the differences if you play it. Yeah, you can move on. Yeah, that's 5,000. And are there natural signals like this? Yes. My favorite crickets produce their nature's tuning forks. The katydid I referred to in the morning produces almost a pure tone as well. So it's just one frequency, their nature's tuning forks. And yes, there are animals that produce such sounds. The sort of opposite of that, if you can think about it, is white noise. So white noise looks a mess in an oscillogram, and basically defined as having equal amounts of energy across all the frequencies. And you can hear them too. And yeah, it's just, yeah. That's white noise. Do animals make sounds like that? Yes, there are animals that produce. Again, crickets produce them. Right, and this is just to give you the frequency range of acoustic signals across which all of you know this stuff. We've just heard so many wonderful talks about elephants and how low they can go, below the range of human hearing, below 20 hertz. And at the other end of the spectrum, of course, there are bats, whales, which can produce very, very high frequency sounds. And then there's this really hard, messy region of acoustic space occupied by a lot of animals, including mammals, birds, amphibians, all kinds of insects. And they are the nightmare to people who try to do AI to separate these sonotypes. Okay, even insects, right? So even insects, yeah, span this entire frequency range. Even within insects, of course, there are the flight tones of bees and mosquitoes, which are pretty low frequency. I mean, 100 hertz is low for an insect. So you've got at the lower end things like bees that can produce flight tones that are really low, and mosquitoes. And what's cool about them, if you've read any of the recent literature, is different species of bees and mosquitoes have different wing beat frequencies. And in mosquitoes, even males and females have different wing beat frequencies. So people are trying to sort of develop apps, especially for mosquitoes. So you can identify the species of disease vector carrying mosquitoes, and also the sex. And what's cool is mosquitoes themselves use these frequencies to find each other, which is a fun fact. And then again, we come into this very crowded region of space, just above 1 kilohertz. We've got crickets, katydids, cicadas, grasshoppers. The true crickets typically produce pure tones between 2 and 9 kilohertz. I remember when I was a student, we used to partition the crickets and the katydids. We said the katydids are usually the broadband callers, the higher frequency callers. Now that's also broken down. We found katydids that produce pure tones, and the record is held by a Malaysian katydid that sings as low as 600 hertz and is a pure tone. And the record at the other end is also held by a katydid that is a pure tone caller at 150 kilohertz. So katydids are a huge challenge. They span the entire frequency range. And cicadas sit somewhere in between over there, as do grasshoppers. And then at the other end, there are moths that can produce sounds. Yes, moths that actually produce sounds to call for mates. Yeah? And these are typically above 20 kilohertz, and again overlap with katydids, and bats sometimes. Okay. So just to give you a feel for a real-world signal, here's a field cricket, and that's what its call looks like. Does that play? Yeah. Yeah, that's a very familiar call all over the world. And if you look at make a recording and look at its oscillogram, that's what it looks like. And you can see one huge stereotypy. And what you can also see is that it's made up of these pulsed units. And, well, that's because crickets produce sound by rubbing their wings. So when the wing closes, you get sound. When it opens, it's silent. So you can tell from here how many times they've opened and closed their wings. And that's how they generate all these different patterns. Different species open and close at different rates. You can make chirps, you can make trills, and that's how you get this enormous temporal diversity among different species. But that's what it looks like if you took an oscillogram. If you took a chunk of this, whether you took, and in this case I know because the species are worked on, whether you take a pulse or whether you take a chirp or whether you take all of these, if you run a power spectrum, then that's what you'll get. You'll see that most of the energy actually sits here at 5 kilohertz. You can also look at it, let me go back. So, amplitude versus time, amplitude versus frequency. Now you can look at it in the third axis, which is frequency versus time, right? Frequency versus time. And this is a very interesting representation. It's what most people who work on birds and mammals use. This is the sonogram or the spectrogram. And this allows you to see whether there's modulation of frequency with time. And typically, if you have most insect signals, I'd be willing to bet, you'll see essentially no frequency modulation. Whereas, again, I won't say all, but most bird and mammal calls will show you a lot of frequency modulation. This, again, is something which is very useful to keep in mind for people who just look at sonograms and want to take a guess. If you see no frequency modulation, you can take something of a bet that it will be an insect or maybe a frog, because there are many frog species also that don't produce very frequency modulated calls. But complete lack of frequency modulation like this would point to an insect. Just to show you at the other end, could you just play that? I think you heard it in the morning, but we can play it again. This is Mycopoda, who probably holds the record for the highest bandwidth terrestrial insect call. And this is the spectrum, and you can see that it's got energy all the way down from about 3 kilohertz and then a huge ultrasonic peak over here, and just getting a recording of this animal in a way that you could see the whole spectrum, and I'll come to that in a minute, is quite a challenge. Okay, let me move on. Right, so now with that introduction, making sound recordings. So the first thing you have to worry about is your microphone. So here I'm first going to go into thinking that you want to walk up to a bird or an insect or a frog and make a recording of that individual. I'm aware that today much more happens with passive acoustic monitoring, which we'll come to later. But this is the good old-fashioned way, and it's still very useful. And you want to get a bird or a frog or a insect. And you want to ask yourself, what kind of microphone should I get? So here's an example. This is something a lot of people who work with birds use, can be used for insects. There are other similar ones as well. But what's the characteristic you should be looking for? There are basically 3 which are really important. The first, of course, is the frequency response. So if you go to any website of a microphone dealer and you look at these, you will then have to look for this. Because, we spend a lot on these microphones, and believe me, I've made these mistakes. And it's really important to be sure that it covers the frequency range that you're interested in. So what does this mean? Basically, it's sensitive between 40 hertz and 20,000 hertz, okay? And if your signal lies within this, then yes, this may be a good microphone, but you should then go in and look at this plot, which is the frequency response plot, which will be there in the technical specifications. And what this is telling you, no microphone is perfect. A perfect microphone should have a flat line. That is, it should be equally sensitive to all frequencies. Otherwise, it's not going to represent your signal with high fidelity. So the flatter the frequency response in your technical specifications, the better your microphone. And of course, that usually sends the cost up astronomically. So so you've got to look at that carefully and ask yourself, do I need that? It really depends on what you need it for. For the kind of work that I do, it's really important to have all these right. But depending on what you need to do, it may not be as important for you. But you have to pay attention, and the flatter the frequency response, always the better. The second important thing to look at is the polar plot, which actually shows you how directional your microphone is. So Catherine Carr just set it up so nicely for me when she spoke about the pressure gradient ear of the lizard, by the way, which echoes exactly how a cricket ear functions, but which is also a directional ear. But when you look at a microphone too, you should be looking at this plot. So what is this telling you? Basically, it's telling you what is the intensity level of sound, the dB/SPL of sound, if your microphone is sitting here in the middle and you take the sound source around the animal, right? What you can see here is that the SPL falls off very sharply as you go around the animal. So your microphone is picking up much more from this region and is basically cutting out sounds from around here. And that's great if you want to focus on one animal and you've got so many other things calling around you that you don't want to pick up. So a highly directional microphone is highly recommended if that's the kind of recording you're interested in. I want to get individuals, and I really don't want interference, as little interference as possible from others. But you might want the opposite, You might, as with soundscapes, want to actually pick up everything there is out there. And then what you need is an omnidirectional microphone, or a microphone where the polar plot looks like this. So as you go around, so you're actually picking up everything from all around equally. So if you want to do acoustic monitoring, for example, this is the best kind of microphone. It's got to be as omnidirectional as possible, so you pick up everything. And here too, of course, you have to pay attention to your frequency response, depending on what you need. The other thing that you will see here is the sensitivity. For example, this one says 30 millivolt per Pascal, which means for 1 Pascal, you get 30 millivolts. If I go back to the other one that had a different specification, what was that here? 50, right? Yeah. 50 millivolt. So what this is telling you is about the sensitivity when you do the conversion from the acoustic to the electrical signal, what kind of gain are you getting? And again, this might be important depending on, how far out do you want to pick up, how much do you want to amplify your signal. And it's important to look at this because you might have wanted the directional microphone and then you picked up the omnidirectional because you didn't know to look for this. And as I said, these are all mistakes I've made. I have no problem admitting to that. And in microphones like the Sennheiser and perhaps in many others, it's not enough to get the microphone. There are accessories, which you will regret if you don't order, which include the powering module, because you have to power the microphone. So there's a powering module that attaches to the microphone, which used in the past, we could just put these alkaline batteries in. Now you can also hook it into your recorder and draw power from that. That, by the way, is called phantom power. So if you see the word phantom power, it basically means you can plug it into your recorder and the microphone can be powered from there. Okay. And one more useful accessory if you're recording in windy areas is to have this cover over the microphone so that you don't get too much wind noise. And okay. Recorders. Yes, I have lived through all of these. from the big old Uher analog cassette tape recorders weighing 14 kgs that I used to lug around during my postdoc days, through the terrible age of digital audio tape. We don't even want to know about these, they were terrible. To the solid state recorders, which we often have now, which are great, they're high quality and fantastic. We don't need to hear tapes and try and acquire data from tapes. You have no idea how many hours one saves. But the difference is that these old cassette tape recorders and things with actual tapes, they were analog signals, they were continuous signals. Whereas these are digital, and which basically means you're taking the sound waveform, which is basically an analog signal, but you're digitizing it. So what your microphone picks up is an analog signal, but everything else downstream after that is sampled now in most recorders. And that brings in problems and complications and the concept of the sampling rate. Because what you're doing basically is to sample this continuous waveform. And of course, if you sample more number of samples per second, you will be better able to reconstruct the waveform, right? So if I only sample here and here, then it's much harder to reconstruct the waveform. Whereas if I take many, many samples, I'll be able to better reconstruct. But if I take many, many, many samples, I have to store many, many, many more bits, and so my files become very large. So there's often a trade-off on what kind of sampling rate should I have. So the sampling rate is simply the number of samples per second that you take of this. And what you will see in many of your recorders is a sampling rate of 44, sometimes 48 kilohertz, which is 44,000 samples per second. So that brings us to another issue, which is the Nyquist frequency. The sampling rate is a very, very important thing. And that comes from this theorem, which the result of which is that the sampling rate of your digitizer or digital recorder must be at least twice the highest expected frequency in the signal. So if you want to analyze your signals in the frequency domain, you have to be sure that when you're making recordings, your sampling rate is at least twice as high. And of course, what do you do for unknown signals? This has always been the problem. So when you have an unknown signal, like an unknown katydid, I usually try to use the max sampling rate I can. And then once I'm sure there's no components in the very high frequency parts of it, then you can later sample at lower rates. The reason that many audio recorders have these sampling frequencies between 40 to 50 kilohertz, 44.1, 48, is because they're tailored for the frequency range of human hearing, which is 20 hertz and up to 20 kilohertz. But Many, many animals, as we all know, actually communicate at much higher frequencies. A few special ones, like elephants, where you needed, as I understand, a 300 kg speaker, communicated very low, but very large number of animals communicate at higher. So if there are infrasonic or ultrasonic components to the signals, then the typical professional audio range recorders are inadequate, and microphones indeed, right? And you'll have to look for a microphone and a recorder that can go up to these much higher frequencies. Another important thing is that the file format in which you store your data should be, if you're interested in spectral analysis, should be, as far as possible, in uncompressed formats like PCM and WAVE. It's not a great idea to use compressed formats if you're interested in detailed spectral analysis. You know, many of these things are things that you can't change post facto, which is why it's important to pay attention to it as you start your study. Here is just one example of a solid-state recorder that was our workhorse for many years, which unfortunately Marantz doesn't make anymore, but there are similar other kinds of models, you know, which have a 96 kilohertz sampling rate. You can store data in uncompressed formats, and that's the kind of recorder that you would have to look for. I'm old-fashioned and also like to have somewhere where I can plug an external microphone if I don't like the inbuilt microphone. So that can sometimes be useful, and of course we want portable ones that can work with batteries or other power sources. So because bats presented a special challenge, there's luckily for us, a whole industry set up manufacturing bat detectors. And we have a range of bat detectors, from the relatively cheaper ones to, again, more expensive ones, but also much better ones. My workhorse for 20 years has been the Peterson, which I would, of course, always highly recommend. And in the good old days, the Peterson couldn't record, so we had to do a lot of gymnastics to get it recorded. But the later models, like the D1000, actually you can even record on this. And basically, these will allow you to catch all the higher frequencies. So if you're looking for signals that are above 10 kilohertz, going all the way up to 200, like bats, then this kind of machine is great. As you can imagine, it was not ideal for katydids, which have also low frequencies. So actually, Lars Peterson was very kind and built me a special microphone to record my Mycophoda, which could sample all the way down to 2 kilohertz. But that's a kind of problem that you can get into if you work on species that have span these difficult frequency ranges. There's also, just for information, the D500X, which is now used for passive acoustic monitoring of bats. And as you can see, again, the samples in the range of 15 to 190 kilohertz, but here you can program it for long-term and unattended recording of bat calls. So the reason I'm going into all of this in some detail is because, especially as a researcher who's starting out, often you go onto websites and there's this bewildering array of information, and you don't know what you really should be looking for and what you miss and what might be important. So which recorder to use? That really, it depends. It's always good to use professional audio. And the typical audio recorder, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, microphones and recorders, typically with sampling rates 44, 48 kilohertz. They're adequate for true crickets, most frogs. There are, by the way, ultrasonic frogs. But most frogs, definitely I would stick my neck out. All birds, large mammals, yeah. Small mammals produce a lot of ultrasound, even if they're not bats. Yeah. And of course, for bats, as I said, there's a whole industry with bat detectors and recorders, so you're sort of lucky there. The kind of things we work on are actually have been for many years technically very difficult to get the right solutions, because they actually span this entire range, and you do need to look for special solutions. Okay. All right, making a recording. Yeah, this is sort of commonsensical. What you try to do really is you want to maximize your signal to noise, your signal to stand out from the noise. And the best way to do that is to get as close as possible, which you can't do, for example, with large mammals like elephants or bison. But with small animals like insects or frogs, you can often get to up to within a meter. Birds and mammals who are not large and dangerous, maybe between 15 and 20 meters. So getting as close as possible, having no obstacles between the sound source and the microphone, and pointing the microphone in the direction of the caller, having a directional microphone, all of these things help. And another important thing to keep your eye on, there's something called the recording level indicator. And this will show you green or it will show you red. So if the signal is too low, you're not getting much signal, increase the sensitivity of this or get closer. But if your recording level indicator goes into red, immediately decrease the sensitivity of the recorder because basically you're then overdriving your recorder. I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. So if you have, and this is something you should always look out for in your signals, clipped signals. So if you have a good signal, then that's how it looks, and you can see the pointy waves if you zoom into the oscillogram. But if you have a clipped signal that you've driven too far, you'll get what are called flat tops. And this is something to look out for. And this is best seen actually in your time series. And this has consequences because it actually mucks up your spectrum. So you can see that this actually it's the same signal. So this is giving you this nice one peak, it's one sine wave, and this is now giving you all these extra peaks, which are not part of your signal at all, but they are due to the clipping. So if you're someone who's look at your spectrum and you say, here are my harmonics. No, these are not. These are artifacts. And so you have to be careful about them. And you can never really avoid them in a field recording because you're always going to get, some pieces that get overdriven and some pieces. But the thing is to look out for it. I think that's important. So whenever I pick any piece to do a spectrogram or spectrum analysis, I would always zoom into the oscillogram first and make sure they're not clipped. Yeah, it's a useful thing to do. And this is just to show you what signal-to-noise ratio looks like. Here is a nice cricket call played from a loudspeaker. This is recorded 0.5 meter. And here's the same call if you just move away 4 meters away. This is at a slightly lower height. And you can see how messed up it's gotten. So this has great signal-to-noise ratio. This has low signal-to-noise ratio. In the spectral representation, also you can see better peaks here and really poorer peaks here. And you want to be closer to this than to that. As I said over and over again, distance matters. This beautiful paper by Heiner Roma in which he broadcast the call of a katydid in the grassland habitat and re-recorded it 5 meters, 15 meters, 30 meters. Basically, the vegetation filters out the high frequencies as well. For those dealing with low frequencies, this is not much of a problem. But if you're really dealing, like many of us do, with higher frequencies, this is something we really have to worry about. Because if I wasn't close enough to my animal, I would think this was its real spectrum, whereas actually it is this. And so that is why in field recordings, getting as close as possible matters. And finally, masking, which all of us are familiar with, which is when there are multiple animals calling together. So here's a spectrogram where many multiple birds are calling together. And that's the kind of recording you will often get, actually, especially in the dawn chorus, right? And how do you deal with this? Well, here, for example, your signal is so much clearly, if you're doing this visually, it's not a problem. It's clearly louder and separable from the background noise, and so you can just ignore the background. If you're doing it manually, I'm sure if you're using algorithms, I don't know how good your algorithms, automated algorithms would be. If your noise, the simplest is if your noise is in a different frequency band than the signal. So here's I think this was my barbet, something like that, signal. And there's noise all over here, but we don't care about this noise. We can just filter it out. The problem, of course, will be when your noise is actually in the frequency range of the signal. And as far as I know, unless there's some very smart signal processing people, you have to throw away these recordings. And for me, the three killers of audio signals that I've recorded over the years: clipping, low SNR, masking. I've throw away typically 50% of my recordings. So that's also something to keep in mind when you go out and say, how many recordings do I need to make? Roughly make at least double of what you might need. Okay, this I showed you in the morning, so I'm not going to repeat it. So if you do that exercise, you can get all kinds of nice. Oh, you're going to hear them again, like it or not. In orchestra. Okay, enough. Yeah. But if you do this painful exercise, as you know we have done, then it sets you up very nicely to do acoustic monitoring of diversity, which is something we have done in our forests. And here is Swati, my student. Because we know who these colors are and what these signals look like, in the old days, we did it by hand, walked around with a recorder. Today, you can set up audio mods or passive acoustic recorders, and you can look at your spectrogram. But the difference is now I know who's calling, right? So I know this is Philomemas. Well, maybe it'll play. Oh, that's this one. Okay. Okay, it's going to go through this anyway. Yeah, this you heard many times. This you heard. Okay, but the important thing is, once you know this, you can, okay, I can't switch these off, I'm sorry. I think they'll switch off by themselves. Yes, thank you. So what we did do was, in early days, we used this to compare, listener-based sampling with instrument sampling. Because we used to, and we still do, a lot of our monitoring, as people who monitor birds do, by actually walking transects or standing in spots in the forest and actually literally counting the number of song patterns that we can hear. And this is powerful because we can do one thing that the automatic algorithms probably will take some years to catch up on. We can actually count the number of individuals because insects are at different positions. We are very good at 3D localizations. I can tell you there's 5 of these, there's 3 of these, et cetera, right? So I can get relative abundance with a listener-based sampling. But if you have a recording at the same time, what we did basically was to compare the proportion of times that the recorder picked up what Swati had heard by ear, and you can see it did quite well, over 90%, okay, for multiple species which were in the somewhat lower frequency bands. Goes without saying, if you're at very high frequencies, the human ear is not going to do so well, and you have to rely on the instrument. So I think the point of this exercise is it's always good to combine the human ear with instruments, and then you will get the whole picture, and I suspect even today that will be true. Then we come into this whole era of passive acoustic monitoring, and I think 2 of the most currently used are the song meter from Wildlife Acoustics, the Audiomoth, and of course there's the bat detector. And these are amazing because I'm sure many of you have used them. You can pre-program them, and they'll record for you around the clock, however you specify. You can also set their sampling rates, which is very nice. As far as I know, the song meter still is up to 48 kilohertz. I think they have a new model which goes up to high frequencies. But this is still, but the Audiomoth is fantastic because it actually spans the entire frequency range, and I'm able to see everything from crickets to bats in 1 sonogram, which is huge. Okay, yeah. But what happens there, again, so the point is that we went from sound libraries where we had identified species, or at least we knew who was producing with sound, and then we could identify them in soundscapes. But this is very laborious. And the reason it's really laborious, the big, at least for us who come from the hyperdiverse tropics, is that the taxonomic identification of who's producing which call is still the big bottleneck in this, to going from getting the sound libraries and identifying that allow you to make sense of this. That is really the bottleneck, I feel, at this point in time. What we have much more frequently, we have an opposite problem now. Because with the availability of so many cheap, high-quality audio recorders, which are put out all over, we have this wonderful library of soundscapes. There's a big data problem there that a whole lot of people are dealing with. I won't talk about that. But what we end up getting is a lot of soundscapes. Soundscapes where we often don't know what we are looking at. And this is, it's a big problem, okay? There are only two ways to tackle this that I can think of. One is to say, I don't care what it is. And so I just look at how many frequency bands there are and maybe how many patterns there are, and I'm happy. And I use some acoustic index or some measure of diversity. But I think for most of us who are biologists, that is not very, it's not a very happy situation to be in unless you've done some ground truthing that tells you that there's actually some real relation between doing these and knowing even just how many species there are. Let me try and illustrate this for you. This is a soundscape from a different rainforest again in southern India, a rainforest where we haven't really worked. Okay? And listening to this, I can pick up what some of these bands are. This is my low-frequency whistling katydid that I spoke about this morning. I can tell you because I know this animal. If I just heard this call, really it would be difficult to know what it was. I know that this is a tree frog, okay? And then we come to this terrible band. I call this the terrible band. And this is, for me, anybody doing AI who can solve this is a whiz. This is a whole host of cricket species, and there could be any number of them. I can see 5 here with my eyes, but there could be any number of them because they all call in that band between 3 and 6 kilohertz. And definitely with single microphone recordings, you're never going to be able to tell them apart. It's not even clear, at least so far, how easily one can do this with arrays to even count how many grillid species there are in this band. So you really don't know. All you know, of course, is there's a lot of noise in this band. Maybe there's lots of individuals. Maybe there are lots of species. Okay? And for me, as an insect bioacoustician, it is funny to see this labeled as noise in bird papers. Okay. I can look up here and say, yes, this is a species. I can't even tell you if it's a cricket or a katydid because this is in a frequency range where it could be either. But I can tell you that this pattern is different from this pattern, and these are 2 different species. I can hazard a guess that these are katydids, and I'd probably be right. Yeah, but that's how you have to move. It's not the best way, but that's all we have. Here's one that my co-author Klaus Rieder sent me from Ecuador. And this is also bad. But here, too, you can look at these 2 bands and say, yes, these are katydids. And then there's this horrendous grillid band, which I would like to challenge any signal processing person with. And you see, there is this band here at about 2 kilohertz, right? Now, who on earth would know that this is actually a cicada? Now, Klaus knows because he has worked in this forest. But if you gave me a 2 kilohertz band like that, and if I listened to it, I would not guess it to be a cicada. This is the problem, But frogs, cicadas, crickets, katydids, very hard to tell which is which if you haven't got some ground truthing done. What do we do with this? Do we say we don't care? I don't know. I leave this to you, but I think this is the big challenge going forward. How do these things relate to real diversity, real species, real even groups of species? I think that's the challenge we are currently facing. And we don't have the libraries, the song libraries, which people in Europe and in North America, for example, worked on for years, but with far fewer species, have these libraries. We don't have these libraries, and building them up will take years and years. But this is the big challenge going forward, because most data are now going to look like this. Yeah? What are we going to do with it? How do we figure out whether anything we compute from this is sensible, something that everyone needs to think about. So that's just the same picture I put up before. We used to go from sound libraries to soundscapes. Now we are having to go from soundscapes to sound libraries, no other way than to ground truth. In countries like India, and I'm sure several parts of Africa, where there are hundreds and hundreds of undescribed insect species whose call, or described species whose calls we don't know. How are we going to get at them? I feel the only answer is citizen science. How do we get people involved in trying to contribute to this the way birders get involved? How much time do I have? I think I should be out of time right now. When did I start? It's been an hour, right? I can stop and not do this last bit if you want. Somebody, I mean, they wanted me to do playback, but I can stop here, no problem. Stop. We stay on time. Yeah. But that was awesome. Well, so, yeah, any questions I'm happy to take, and you can also come to me later and talk to me. I hope this was useful to at least some of you.
All right, guys. So, yeah, if we've got any questions, just a couple of minutes of questions, perhaps, if anybody has. Are we all good?
If I didn't send everyone to sleep.
One over here.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for bringing in your humor and your insights into that process as well. I was just wondering about your ground truthing challenge, as you mentioned. And in some ways, I work on marine creatures, and we're also trying to figure out what a lot of the sounds are coming from. So it's sort of nice to hear that there is a terrestrial striving to trying to find that. What would you say, and I know this is a hard question to answer, but what would you say are some of the ways in which you think people can advance that ground truthing effort, and as individuals or as communities try to really push that forward?
Yeah, I think that today with mobile phones having, recorders and stuff, I think if people, even local schools or colleges or even interested citizens went out and made recordings, I mean, the bird community has used all of this to advantage for so many decades. At least at the level of soundscapes, people could make recordings and put them up. Or if they saw an interesting insect or heard an interesting insect, they could make a sound recording and put it up. I know people love to go and photograph things, but not necessarily make sound recordings. But if people could go out and make recordings and get the photograph, it would of course be great to get the specimen, because without it, insects, you just can't identify the species, but at least you get some idea what it is. If you can get a photograph and a call that you're confident of and the location, at least, in a community, there may be people, like you give me a Mycopoda call, I can tell you immediately it's a Mycopoda, right? So there are some genera that are very easy to pick up. So at least those easy to pick up genera. iNaturalist has done wonders, for telling us distributions of insects, for example. If the same thing can be done in the audio domain, at least we'll know where certain kinds of calls are distributed and where the big challenges are. So that's a beginning, right? But it's very hard because many of these are nocturnal. And I know how hard it is to actually follow one of these, get a recording, figure out what is calling, not easy, right? But if people can get, challenged by it, the way photographers are crazy, the birders are crazy, but can people get equally motivated. I feel without citizen science, this is too big a problem to solve. Yeah.
Which actually leads me to plug, I think, the special session which we've got on Wednesday afternoon, which is basically, if I could just take that last slide of yours and just put it in that session, is all about the sound library, citizen science to machine learning kind of process, and how we're going to need a combined effort, I think, to be able to maximize the utilization of machine learning in our soundscape analysis. So, that was.
Thing
go on.
that I can add to that.
Yep.
So we're going further and further with the machine learning. Where we are not going further with is with getting our taxonomy right, with getting our ground truthing right. And so we're already in a place where there's too much of the machine learning stuff, and we actually don't know what we're analyzing, certainly with insects.
And I'm going to add to that and say that's the most fun part. So, absolutely, going out and making the recordings, as I think a lot of us will agree, is the most fun part. And so, to add on to that just quickly and say that one of the things we're thinking of proposing for next year as an output from the African bioacoustics community is a bioacoustics big year. And so I'm going to throw that out here now as a way of maybe promoting within you guys for this week some thoughts about how this might happen, how we could encourage other people to collect this data through citizen science, through iNaturalist. At the moment, I think iNaturalist, the format isn't quite right. I think it's MP3 they upload. So there's different routes that we can maybe think of, but I think getting that data to feed into the work that would feed into Soundscape work would be really great. So across insects, birds, fish, marine mammals, all of that. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now and say thank you very much. And